How are you doing, Nathan?
Yeah, all well here, Will. We are in a bit of self-isolation at the moment. My son's not been very well, so we've got a good 14 days in. Um, Obviously in lockdown now anyway, so um, yeah.
I'm sorry to hear your son is unwell, Nathan. Interesting that you're getting some first-hand experience of self-isolation. Interestingly, this podcast is recorded the day after the Prime Minister just announced that the whole country is to be put in lockdown. So really testing times for everyone at the moment.
Yeah. It's a very strange, sort of surreal period, isn't it? It's a bit unusual to kind of, this sort of thing. I don't think has ever happened at least not in my lifetime. I'm not sure about yours, but yeah, it's a kind of unique situation for all of us, really.
Really is, really is. Well, it's great to have you on the podcast, Nathan. And in this episode, we're going to look at your paper that was recently published in The Psychologist on dealing with the psychological challenges of isolation and confinement during this COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm hoping we can discuss some of the issues from this and breathe it to life.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Yeah, happy to talk about it.
One thing just to start with, there's a lot of different lingo being thrown around. There's this idea of quarantine, then there's isolation, there's also social distancing. Would you be able to unpack some of that? What do all of these terms mean, and are they different?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll start by saying I'm definitely not an expert on all of these kind of different terminologies and that sort of thing. But the way I understand it is, we've got these sort of different tiers. So we've got, or we did have before the lockdown came into effect, we had this sort of social distancing idea of keeping a certain degree of distance and separation between you and other people if you were out and about. We have that self isolation. So this is a slightly more autonomous choice that if you are feeling sort of symptoms that might reflect coronavirus, then you should stay indoors and stay away from public spaces and in effect self isolate. And then I think then we start shifting towards something slightly more extreme. So the quarantine is probably a little bit more what we're all experiencing now in lockdown. So we've been sort of told that we have to stay indoors for most of the day. People that are confirmed COVID cases are in sort of full quarantine, if you like. So they're either stuck in their houses with symptoms and they can't leave, and they're having to get stuff delivered and left on their doorstep, or there are obviously some people that are slightly more unwell, and they will be in sort of quarantine conditions in hospitals. So I think that's probably the difference between those three things.
So, Nathan, whilst many people across the country are in lockdown or in self isolation, they feel that their agency has been taken from them. And this is a key theme in your article. Can you tell me more about the role that agency plays in coping with isolation and confinement?
Yeah, I mean, so we know from lots of domains that agency is sort of a fundamental human need. Like we all do better when we're in control of our decisions and choices, and we have some ownership over what we do. So I think that's why when we start talking about quarantine, that's why its potential for negative mental health impacts is so strong, because it actually takes our agency off us. So we might not have kind of physical illnesses, but we're having this kind of really fundamental desire taken away, um, and that for some people can be quite disruptive and damaging.
Yeah, do you think the UK government's approach by imploring us to stay in our homes and avoiding a police lockdown is part of a strategy to not deprive us of too much of our own agency?
Yeah, I do actually. So I've sort of my wife and I've been chatting about some of the decision making up to this point. The government have approached this idea, and I sort of, without wanting to back any different types of political party, I do sort of understand the thinking of wanting to keep this quarantine period as short as possible because they know it's going to be hard for people. But then the decision to frame it in a way that promotes this sense of understanding, and like this sort of empathetic reason for wanting to do the quarantine, or the self isolation, it captures something a little bit more intrinsic within us. Identifying the importance of caring and helping other people is slightly different than just being told we have to stay indoors. And I think that's probably part of the messaging.
There's a great article from the Lancet that you reference in your paper that describes the main adverse psychological effects of confinement. What are those?
So from a psych, so the article in the Lancet was a systematic review, a rapid systematic review of the psychological effects of quarantine. So it's well worth going and digging out if people are interested in reading more. And I think in there, what Samantha Brooks and the team at King's College talked about were a few different things. So they talked about threat. So we know when quarantine conditions are activated, there's something going on that is quite dangerous. So there's this sort of sense of threat and dread. And if people are self-isolating now and they're starting to get sort of cough and cold type symptoms, they might automatically start jumping to think, oh, is it coronavirus? So there's this sort of lingering uncertainty, which accompanying that might be fearful feelings. Um, Depending on how long the quarantine goes on, people might start having dips in their moods. They might start to get irritable, and if you're stuck in a small space with lots of other people, if you've got a family around you, being under each other's feet for a long time each day for a long period of time, there might be some social tension starting to occur as well.
So, Nathan, a lot of your research has been studying what you call ICE groups. That's people working in isolated, confined, or extreme settings. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so probably for quite a few years now, we've been working with these ICE groups. And these are people that go off and do things in kind of extreme and unusual environments. So when we talk about ICE, like you just said, it's the isolated, confined, and extreme population. So that's people that are going and living at Antarctic research stations, submariners, people taking part in space simulation studies, so practicing missions for Mars. And we've also been doing some work on the International Space Station as well. So a big range of people. There is a sort of a different population that we work with that are they're not so much confined, but they are in isolated settings, and that's expedition goers. So people that go on kind of skiing and mounting expeditions to kind of polar and the greater ranges. What's interesting about them is that they are outside, every day doing things, but then they do have to live in sort of tented habitats that are quite small and confined. So they're living in close quarters with people often.
Do you think there's lots of transferable learning that we can take from studying these ICE groups that we can take into understanding how families across the world suddenly thrust into close confinement with one another, how we can better understand their situation and support them?
Yeah, I think to some extent we can. So I think there's definitely a distinction to be made in terms of the decision to go. So not many people will have chosen to self isolate and quarantine without some reason, that a kind of push to do it. Whereas people that go to these ICE settings that are putting themselves forward and they often are heavily trained to go to these places. So there's a difference between the kind of the person um, when we're considering these kind of this crossover. But what we often talk about when we talk about making comparisons is not just the physical similarities between the settings, but it's the psychological and social experience. So people that are in ICE environments might have quite similar psychological and social experiences to people that are isolating in the UK at the moment, in terms of the monotony that they might face, the lack of stimulation, the separation from friends and family. So we use those psychological and social aspects to compare more so than the physical context necessarily.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. That's really interesting. So let's move on now to some suggested strategies for how we can mitigate some of the psychological impacts of isolation. And let's start with this idea of threat, fear, and uncertainty that's so pervasive at the moment. What learning can we take from these ICE settings that could help us right now with that?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to say is there's a slight distinction we can make between anxiety and fear. So anxiety is a sort of anticipation. It stems from an anticipation of something to come, that may be uncertain but might lead to some kind of harm. Whereas and that can be quite chronic sometimes. So if we're sort of anticipating into the future, we might have days and days of anxiety. And if it's something to do with kind of COVID-19 and we don't know when things are going to end, then that could be going on for quite a long time. Fear is something that's a bit more state specific. So it usually occurs when we find ourselves in a scary situation, and we respond with this kind of fearful response. Both of those things are evolved to do something functional for us. So they're designed to keep us safe, and to help us survive in sort of scary, dangerous, uncertain, threatening situations. I guess the problem occurs when they're chronic, and they're not resolved. So in terms of the strategies that people use, so the people that we've been studying in these ICE environments, they talk about controlling the controllables. So there's lots of things about COVID-19 that we can't control, but there are things that we can. So we can follow the guidance we've been provided. We can make sure our hygiene is good. We can develop good safety type routines. If we do have to go to supermarkets to buy supplies, we can make sure we follow the distancing rules, that sort of stuff. The other thing is to try and bring the time perspective that you're adopting in. So focus on what's going to be happening in the next hour, the next half day, the next week, rather than forecasting out to the next month, and so on. And that just brings us, we to really reduce feelings of anxiety and fear, we need to get ourselves into a position where we feel like we can control stuff, and that helps us just maintain that sort of sense of control.
I see. So just taking things day by day. Yeah, and focusing on some small, maybe achievable tasks at a time, and trying not to overwhelm ourselves with the enormity of what faces the whole population.
Yeah, I mean, and then there are some other things. So we've been doing a bit of work recently on COVID-19 specifically, and we've been talking to people that are experts in sort of managing anxiety and fear, and a lot of what we've heard is that people will be having kind of inaccurate threat perceptions and appraisals of situations. So they're seeing a threat where actually the threat isn't really there, and it's because everything feels threatening at the moment because there's so much uncertainty. So if we can start trying to take a step back from some of these situations and actually think rationally and logically about it, then we might be able to better assess what is actually threatening and what isn't.
So often the perceived threat is much greater than the actual threat. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's it.
It's all about how we perceive and conceptualize that, and perhaps you talking about taking time to do a bit of inner work to really try and reframe things in our own minds. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and really, if we're thinking about what the risks are, is really trying to get to grips with what actually are the risks, and using the good quality information that's available to us to understand them, rather than relying on kind of hearsay that's maybe going around on social media. So relying on good sources of information will help with that. The other thing that we can do to reduce kind of anxiety and fear is if there are things that we are finding stressful, or we think we might be stressful over the next day or week or so, we could try and write them down, um, and then whilst we're doing that, try also writing down the resources that we have, so all the things that are available to us to cope with those demands. Because what we'll find often is that we actually have quite a lot available to us to deal with the things that we're forecasting to happen. It's just maybe about going through and actually acknowledging to yourself that you've got lots of kind of coping resources to deal with those things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so getting a pen and paper, writing that down. Okay, and does that tie in with the practice of journaling as a tool to help process some of these feelings? Do you think?
Yeah, so I think journaling is kind of one of the we've been doing a project where we've been interviewing expedition goers and people that go off into extreme environments recently, and pretty much exclusively everyone talked about journaling when they were off out in these places. And the way they were talking about it was that it just provides an opportunity. It's quite cathartic. It provides an opportunity to get rid of things that might be frustrating you, or where you can kind of share some of your anxieties and fears, and sort of get it out. which is a good way of releasing it. And you don't necessarily have to share that with anyone. It's just a way of maybe externalizing some of that stuff that's building up. And we know, historically, people that have gone off to Antarctica and sailed, on sailing voyages, they've kept quite detailed journals, and you can see in those writings this kind of almost a therapeutic process of writing about it.
Yeah, Nathan, it's really interesting you mentioned journaling. That's actually something I've been experimenting with the last 6 months before this COVID thing kicked off. I do a little daily journal in an app on my phone. I use Memento. Many people I know journal in a notebook, but I find just capturing my thoughts for that day, I find it very cathartic. It helps me to process some of the negative emotion. And most interestingly, when I read back through my entries from weeks before, it always surprises me what I was worried about at that point in time and how that was really just in that moment. And getting that perspective, having that hindsight of that time reminds you of just how negative emotion and anxiety, particularly around COVID, it can vary day to day. One day you think, I'm terrified that my family are all going to get this and that all these people are going to die, and then the next day you're able to kind of to rationalize that in your head. And so journaling's been something I've definitely found very helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree. There's a few things about journaling that I just think are really nice. It gets us away from the computer, gets us away from kind of lots of information flooding in. It's also a physical activity as well, in terms of actually sitting with a pen potentially and writing something out. Which, when we're thinking about a threat that we can't see, like the virus, actually sitting down and producing something that we can see. Provides a contrast to that.
I think it's a really practical and elegant strategy that people could try at home. It requires minimal equipment, and we like minimal equipment in expedition settings. But particularly now, where the shops are closed and they might not have much many different things to occupy your time, but all you need is a notepad on your phone or a pen and paper, and it's something we can all try and might be very helpful for people. So yeah. Another aspect of confinement and isolation, which I'd like to touch on, is this idea of monotony and boredom. Being stuck in with your family for weeks on end and running out of things to do. And is this something that the great explorers and these extreme people that you've worked with, is this something they've experienced? And if so, what techniques have they tried to mitigate against this?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we hear a lot with this kind of the monotony, the boredom, the repetition. What's quite interesting at the moment is that people that we've gone into the sort of self-isolation quarantine period, and I think there's lots of buzz about things that people are doing. So if you go on social media, you'll see lots of different ways that people are keeping themselves occupied, and that's fantastic. But I'm sort of interested in what happens next, and what happens in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks time. Are people still going to be developing these creative solutions? And hopefully they will. But that's when some of the monotony might set in. And I think that's where having some good kind of techniques in place. So, maybe developing routines that allow you to adapt to this kind of situation we're in now to be something more normal for you is quite helpful. Using food as a way of kind of celebrating progress or celebrating milestones, celebrating that with your family that maybe you're with, or through using technology and sharing it with other people remotely could be a really good idea.
Yeah, I really like that idea of creating context to just routine day-to-day events. So making that meal special somehow, making it a celebration of something that's happened that day. I think that's a really nice idea. Can you tell me about what Ernest Shackleton's crew did on their Antarctic expedition to stave off the boredom?
Yeah, I mean they did all sorts. They had some pretty creative ways of keeping themselves occupied. So they used to do kind of theatre shows. They used to listen to music and wind up the music. They used to have these quite long, rambling conversations about nothing at all, really. Just sort of the most bizarre um, topics that they could think about discussing. And actually, we hear that when we interview people that go on expeditions now. We hear that after a few weeks, when they're in the environment, they might have a few months to go. They start coming up with games of what's your top five certain categories for whatever it might be. What's the what invention would you create if you could create anything? And these sort of little mental challenges to keep people going is quite important. I mean, the mental challenge aspect is quite interesting because although we've got in these kind of resource-rich environments that we'll be isolated in, we've got quite a lot of stuff to keep us occupied. In some places, especially if we're thinking about quarantine in a hospital, for example, it might be quite sensory depriving. And so that's where coping with that sort of stuff, people might have to go a bit more inward. And there's lots of really good examples of people that have been taken hostage and kind of kept in solitary confinement, actually internalizing and creating whole worlds inside their head to keep themselves busy.
Right. I mean, is that a good thing, or can that lead to other issues?
So, I mean, obviously, it's probably quite a traumatic experience being kidnapped, I would think. But I think the thing that does do is it creates a sense of control when there is no control, because they can't take your mind off of you. So you are empowered to create these worlds in your head if you're in that situation, and developing those kind of visualization techniques might be quite helpful.
Yes, that's really interesting. I've definitely heard that described by people, to Frankl, for example, who have been in solitary confinement or in prison environment for a number of years, sometimes decades at a time, and how they've created their own world in their heads to cope with that. Fortunately, with the COVID-19 pandemic, people do still have access to books, their laptops, the internet, etc. So we're not perhaps quite that far. But I just wonder whether this is an opportunity for us to really think about what's essential to us for our well-being. And we live in an age where there's an overabundance of media, of different sensory inputs, and I think in a sense that can be quite overwhelming. And just hopefully having that stripped back will enable us to spend a bit of time with our own minds and think about a few key practices that can keep us well.
Yeah. I mean, it's like anything with any sort of situation. There's more than one way to view what's happening now. And I think we have a choice to view it as something quite negative, or if we adopt the mindset that you've just had, Will, is that there's an opportunity here to develop some competencies in terms of our own self-management in our mental health, that might help us in down the line in a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your article, you reference other techniques for staying well, which don't require anything at all other than their own mind. So things like self-talk, visualization, breathing practices, and meditation. How could those be used to help people?
So I mean, self-talk is something that's really is quite empowering. So we hear often people having sort of mantras, and when things get a bit tough, then they can fall back on these sort of sayings or these quite inspiring messages that they've read somewhere, or quotes that keep them going. The visualization and imagery is what we talked about a few minutes ago. So there's a sort of escapism to some of that, is maybe visualizing some places that you've been that it makes you feel good when you go back there in your mind. Um, the breathing, I think, particularly for something like anxiety and fear, the breathing and meditation techniques are really helpful, because they help center us, and they can help bring down our kind of autonomic activation levels. What's also interesting about breathing is if we practice it, so if we do these sort of breathing techniques and we practice them, we actually get better at controlling our sort of parasympathetic nervous system. So we're better able at kind of controlling that response. And it's like any of these things are skills. So the more we practice it, the better we are at using it.
How would you suggest it for people out there who have never tried breathing or meditation? how would you suggest they get started with something like that?
I mean, there's some great tutorials on YouTube, like everything nowadays. So people are probably going on YouTube to do DIY while they're stuck at home, but you could use it to go and find out about some kind of simple breathing techniques. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could be just to sort of count a number of seconds of breathing in and breathing out, and just do it for a period of time, and just pay attention to how your body feels when you're doing it, and sort of really focus internally on what's going on. And that could be a really good technique just to calm some of that sort of threat and fear and anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of power in whatever you do in just unplugging and detaching, particularly from 24-hour news and from social media, and spending a bit of time just with your own thoughts, and to give yourself a bit of peace and time to process things. I think must be really, really powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to one of the third aspects of confinement that's well described in the literature: low mood and motivation. And I think this might be something we see perhaps further into this, as this becomes month 2, month 3, as this drags on. Are there any other additional things that could help people stave this off?
Yeah, I mean, so the low mood and motivation, I think it's almost inevitable at some point people are going to have some of those feelings. It's not necessarily going to be a clinical issue, but it might just be feeling a bit kind of lethargic and a bit fed up with the situation. And I'd say that's pretty normal. Like, most people experience that at some point, so that's probably quite helpful just to acknowledge that that's a normal thing to feel. Um, I think some of the stuff we talked about earlier in terms of making sure you are kind of monitoring progress, and just looking back and thinking, okay, I've already done so many weeks of this now, and just taking some pride and satisfaction in that can be quite powerful. Um, I think some of the other things about kind of trying to find the positives in the situation, trying to have a laugh about some of it, trying to just sort of joke around, and um, maybe try and take some of it a bit less seriously if it's starting to get on your nerves. Just make fun of the situation. There's plenty of cat and dog videos on YouTube you can go and watch if that helps.
Oh, yes, it's interesting you say that. My wife is totally addicted
Yeah.
to cat videos on Facebook. It's created a whole problem of its own.
Yeah. And then there's also, I think there's actually a website that someone set up on justpositivenewsstories.com or something like that, where it's just got kind of like interesting positive stories that are coming out of this situation we're all in. So that could be a nice way of kind of just boosting your morale a little bit as well.
So another daily practice that I've been playing around with for the last year or so is a win the day list. So in the morning, while I'm having my bowl of porridge, I write down on a small post-it note the things I want to do that day, or the way I want to interact with others in the world around me. And I choose a post-it note because it, by virtue of its size, it stops me getting too carried away and too ambitious. And then once I've done that, I fold it up, stick it in my back pocket. And then at the end of that day, I revisit it and I look down the list at all the things that I've done. And I'm always amazed at just how much I've achieved. I think it gives you that sense of accomplishment. And especially during lockdown, I think where perhaps we aren't doing as much as we might normally be doing, just putting simple things on there, like just getting out of bed, getting out of my pajamas, making breakfast for my wife, calling family, just little things like that really, really gives you that sense of having actually done something. I've certainly found that very, very powerful for my own well-being, and something maybe other people might like to try too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good technique, because it's got the whole, you set the goal and you revisit it, and you just give yourself that little pat on the back and little reward for achieving it.
Yeah, and what's really interesting in terms of how the public has responded to this pandemic is the outpouring of positive sentiment and camaraderie to the wider community. Certainly on our street, there's been WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups that have been set up to enable people to get shopping in for their elderly neighbours, and just support one another. And I think there's loads of opportunities right now for us to do really positive acts of kindness, to each other.
Yeah, and that's really, really important when we're in these sort of socially isolated conditions. We talked about agency being a fundamental human need. Well, belonging is as well, and we know we're sort of social creatures. So just trying to keep that fire burning in terms of our connectedness to others is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that connectedness, and there's this kind of strange paradox in a sense that we are quite disparate geographically. We're isolated within little units within our households, but we've never been more connected in a kind of digital sense.
Yeah. So I mean, it's what's quite interesting. I'm sure other people. I think I've seen people say this already, actually, but I'm sure other people are finding it. Is I've probably spoke to my parents more the past, more consistently the past week or so than I have done for quite a few years, with sort of daily calls and.
Is that a deliberate effort that you've made to stay connected with them, or?
Yeah, I think so, and it's just the acknowledgement that they're on their own as well. They're not able to go and see their friends, so it's just that sort of little bit of effort to just touch base and check in and just you know lighten the load a little bit, and you can have a little moan or you can have a laugh about something that's happened.
Yeah, it's interesting how platforms like Zoom and WhatsApp are being finally adopted by the older generations. They're forced into this new technology through necessity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, one thing an additional aspect for medics listening to this about having to self-isolate is the moral injury from not being available on the front line, from feeling like you need to be there helping out, but being held back. You've got minimal symptoms, but you have to self-isolate. Have you got any thoughts on how medics can reconcile and perhaps approach this in a positive way?
Yeah. It's a tough one, isn't it? Because it's these people are trained. This is what they're trained to do, and it sort of feels like the skills are being wasted. But I think the important thing to remember is this is it's a marathon, not a sprint, and that this is going to be going on for probably quite some time, and those skills will be needed later down the line, and trying to sort of keep that rational perspective of okay, I might be missed for a week or 2 weeks, but actually there's a whole, there's several months more that I can contribute to, and that the other people that are fit and healthy and in the team will be able to do the job. So I think it's that sort of trying to keep that kind of rational perspective and take on the situation. And I think the other thing of that is, if you're obviously if you're really unwell when you're isolating, then it's slightly different. But if you're just a little bit groggy or you're asymptomatic, but you've been in contact with people that are tested positive, is actually then take that time to really refresh yourself, and use it as an opportunity to get some rest and have some good food, because once you're back in the hospital environment, you're probably going to be worked quite hard.
Yeah, I really like that idea, Nathan, of health professionals using a period of self-isolation to really to really do some self-care and firm up those foundations so that they're in a really strong place when they do go back to work, and they can then take on that additional strain of the workload.
Yeah, and I think it's not a unique. I mean, that challenge is not a unique one either. Will, I was just sort of reading and speaking to some colleagues that were involved in Ebola and sort of SARS before that, and they faced the same challenges. Going in, and having to sort of step back because they didn't have the right personal protective equipment, or there were situations where what they had to make a choice, and in these situations we talk about least worst decision making. You have to pick between two pretty bad choices, but crucially, these people are yourself and other medics are highly trained people, and we need to keep you going for as long as we can, and so that might mean just taking a step back.
Yeah, absolutely. So we should all be, this is a call to arms for us all to practice and develop our self-care, whether that's during a period of self-isolation or at any time, really. I think it's a kind of key message here, isn't it?
Yeah.
And one other thing that came up in your article, Nathan, was this idea of having a passion project that really gives you a sense of purpose. What passion projects are you working on at the moment? And have you got any suggestions that are projects that people could get involved with while they're stuck at home?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm pretty busy at the moment with some of this COVID stuff. So we are actually we're developing a resource for people that are on the front line and for people supporting those on the front line. And I'm doing that on top of my actual day job. And that's called Support the Workers. So there's a website called supporttheworkers.org. And that for me, that's a bit of a passion project. So that's something I'm doing kind of in the evenings around my sort of day-to-day tasks. The reason I'm doing that is because I feel passionately about helping medics and trying to make a contribution, although not in a hospital, but trying to do something that helps people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic resource, that, and I really encourage people to have a look at that. We'll put a link in the show notes, but there's resources there on motivation, anxiety and fear, moral injury, resilience. It's really good, and it's very carefully referenced with some really kind of practical, actionable recommendations. So go and check it out.
Yeah, and then I mean, at home we've come up with a few little games that we're playing to keep ourselves interested. So we have a fridge covered in letter magnets. So my wife and I are doing a kind of word of the day on alternate days to see who can beat each other. Yeah, we obviously I'm winning, so it's all good for now. We Yeah, not competitive at all. Um, yeah, we're doing some stuff with music, sort of selecting soundtracks to listen to for each other, that sort of thing. Um, yeah, so there's some sort of little bits that keep us together, keep us motivated.
So in terms of passion projects, I think it's great to have something on the side that's completely unrelated to the pandemic or virus, that's perhaps a bit silly and a bit fun. It's learning a new skill, just to take your mind off
Yeah,
things. And for
classic.
me
Yeah.
recently, that's been learning to juggle. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's very playful, quite creative. I mean, you can do it with anything. You
Yeah.
can just bruise up some apples from the fruit bowl, and it's endless. And I've just been exploring different YouTube videos, just different 3-ball patterns, and it's been great. And it really takes my mind off things. So if you've got a bit of extra time, I'd encourage anyone out there
Yeah,
to try and learn a new skill.
definitely. Yeah, I guess the final thing is exercise as well. We're trying to do plenty of that.
And thank goodness we can still do that. We're allowed, according to current guidance, to go out once a day for exercise, a personal exercise.
So yeah, so just I mean, if you can get outside, and I mean the weather, at least the weather at the moment is quite nice, so you can always do a kind of hit session in the garden or something like that.
And of course, do you ever kind of go for runs around where you are? Or do you do anything else
Yeah,
to get outside?
yeah, we're quite lucky actually. So we're sort of in the countryside here, so we can get out, and either in the morning I'll put the baby in the papoose and go for a little wander in the up the by the river and in the trees, or we'll get on the trails and sort of away from everyone else and have a bit of a blowout, which is always good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's great to be able to do that while we still can. I do wonder whether the lockdown will be extended and actually, even that kind of activity will start to be restricted. Yeah. Well, anyway, Nathan, thank you so much for your wise words and your insights. That's certainly been very helpful to me, and there's been lots of stuff there that I'm going to go and take away from this. That I will both recommend to my patients that will be self-isolating, and also I'll apply to myself. If people want to reach out or connect with you, how can they do that?
So happy to speak to people if they want to have a chat or get in touch. So I'm on Twitter at Dr. Nathan J Smith, and on email nathan.smith@manchester.ac.uk. So people can get in touch, find me some questions if they want. Yeah, and it's just been a real pleasure to be on the show.
Thanks for coming on, Nathan. Great to chat.